Hello, my lovely anatomists and physiologists. Michele here, and we are continuing our discussion of chapter 14. And what we are doing now is sort of putting together what we've learned about the nervous system in terms of our somatic division. So we're still just thinking about somatic division, which remember, we're thinking here about our body. And in this context, our body is talking about skin, muscle, and bone. Let's stop for just a minute and think about this term tracts, which we've defined several times. So we should understand the word tract is talking about myelinated axons in the central nervous system, carrying the same type of information, same direction, and about the same speed. So we're talking specifically then about white matter in here in the central nervous system. So remember, that means both the brain and the spinal cord. When we talk about a path that's ascending, that means it's traveling up. So this is information that's being collected by the body, coming into the spinal cord, and then making its way up to the brain for processing. Okay, so we're traveling up to the brain. And so if it's information coming in from the spinal cord, then or in from the body, then we should think about this as sensory information. Now here is we're talking about information from the body to the spinal cord up to the brain. We are thinking here about the somatosensory information or stimuli from below the neck. Otherwise, information from above the neck, head and neck, that's going to be traveling through cranial nerves. And so that kind of pathway will be a little bit different. So we are thinking here in terms of, let's say, spinal nerves when we're talking about our tracts. The other thing that we need to remind ourselves of is actually a new word, which is decussation. I said remind ourselves because we have that hemispheric lateralization of the cerebrum, right? So that's talking about sensory information from the left side of the body has to somehow make its way to the right hemisphere for processing. Decussation is talking about this crossover that's happening of sensory information, and we'll see also motor information in the future. So when we are talking about our ascending tracts, we do have a question about where does this decussation, where does this crossover happen? And there's two places. It can either be at the spinal cord level. So when sensory information comes in, it can immediately cross and then make its way up, or it can come in, ascend on the same side, and then cross over at the brainstem level. And so as we're talking about these ascending tracts, we will be talking about, oh, where does it decussate or where is it crossing over? The other pieces of information here that we need to pay attention to is structures of the brain that we've talked about before. So let's remind ourselves of the thalamus. This is our relay center. Remember, it's part of the diencephalon. And it's really going to have the job of sending that information to the correct part of the cerebrum for processing. So we might think about it as, the person in the mail room who's getting all the letters and then sticking it into the right mailboxes, type of thing. We can talk about this as a required transfer point for all information with the exception of olfaction. So olfaction, remember, our sense of smell has kind of this unique situation of totally bypassing the thalamus. And then I think the other important piece of information to recall from our previous conversations is the location of the primary somatosensory cortex. This is located, remember, post central gyrus, which is part of the parietal lobe. So remember, parietal lobe is a division, a section of the cerebrum. Cortex, remember, we're talking about gray matter. So this is a processing center. Somatosensory, remember, is talking about sensations of the body. In this context, when we think about the body, we're thinking about skin, muscle, bone. So we're thinking about sensations like touch, pressure, vibration, pain, temperature, proprioception, kinesthesia. These are these types of sensations that we're thinking about here. Now, when we look at the primary somatosensory cortex, we can look at a map of the body showing which neurons process information from like each part of the body. Meaning, there's one section of the cerebrum that's processing sensory information from the hand. And it's going to be a lot bigger, really, than the section of the cerebrum that's processing information from the back. Why would that be? You know, if we want to really see something new and investigate something new, we're going to grab it with our hands. We might want to touch it. We might want to pull it apart. We're going to do a lot of sensory engagement with our hands. We don't really do that with our back, right? We don't really say like, oh, let me touch that with my back. Let me see how that feels with my back. So our back is not, you know, our skin and musculature and so forth of our back is not as sensitive to somatosensation in the same way that our hands are. So when we're studying as scientists, when we've studied the primary somatosensory cortex, we've actually like mapped out this region of the primary somatosensory cortex is processing from the hand, this is processing from the arm, this is processing from the lips and tongue, this is processing from the skin around the eyeball. And so we have created this kind of diagram to represent that, and we call it a sensory homunculus. And this is a great Google this, sensory homunculus. You're going to find some really interesting images here. And what we'll see again is that you don't have the same amount of tissue dedicated to all regions of the body. So some regions have way more and some regions have way less. And again, it really just depends on like how we use our body. So sensory homunculus is just like a diagram or a map. It's just helping us conceptualize what's going on at that primary somatosensory cortex. Okay, so as we are thinking about these ascending tracks, you can think about these as highways or dedicated fiber optic cables. Remember, it's transmitting the same sort of information in the same direction. In this case, everything is ascending at about the same speed. So let's take a look at our cross section or transverse section of our spinal cord. This is our model that we've been working with throughout this entire period of time. And let's remind ourselves that we have sort of at the front, well, let's just say we've got the white matter on the outside of the gray matter, and the white matter we divide up into columns. So we have at the front on each side the anterior white column. We have on the sides the lateral white column. And we have at the very back the posterior white column. And remember, we talked in a previous video about having that spinal ganglion or dorsal root ganglion as this kind of bulge in that dorsal root or posterior root. And that's a great way for us to know the back from the front. When we talk about these columns, what we'll see is the columns are full of tracks. So the column is kind of like a big bundle of tracks, and that's sort of my definition. So that may not be a great definition. What we're going to see is that we have different tracks running through different areas. So I'm going to grab a highlighter here, and I'm going to actually, in this case, highlight the entire posterior white column, and I'm just doing this on one half of my diagram here. And when I highlight this entire area, what we're going to see is that there's an entire track that's running back here. There's an entire track that's running back here. And this track is going to be actually named for this whole column. So we can talk about tracks as being tracks or pathways. And so this one is going to be called the posterior column pathway, or we can talk about it as a track. So we can also talk about that as a track. So that whole back area there is collecting sensory information and sending it up to the brain for processing. We'll also see in the OpenStax book that this is also called the dorsal column pathway or track. So you might want to kind of keep that in mind if you are going to grab this information from your reading. I'm going to grab a different color highlighter. And now what we're going to do is highlight kind of along the edge of the lateral white column, sort of the back edge, but not the entire area. And then come kind of to the side of the anterior white column. And what we're going to see is that these two regions make up what's called the spinocerebellar. So the one that's behind, the one that's on the lateral white column, is going to be called the posterior spinocerebellar track. And the one that's kind of on the side of the anterior white column is going to be called the anterior spinocerebellar tract. So again, remember, a column is a bundle of tracks. And so what we're trying to do here is use our highlighter to actually show where these tracks would be. I'm going to grab a different color here. And so now I'm going to go in the front little piece of the anterior white column. And this is going to be making up what is called the anterior spinothalamic track. Anterior spinothalamic track. And I'm going to use the same color, but I'm going to come over here to the lateral white column. And I'm going to label this one as my, really showing my arrows in the wrong direction. So let me fix that. And so this one on the lateral side is my lateral spinothalamic track. Now, all of these are ascending, but they're all carrying different sensory information. So what I'd like to do now is stop this video and pick up the next video talking more specific detail about these ascending tracks. So stay tuned. As always, take care of yourselves and each other.